we have a special treat for you today. Dr. Ray Perryman, who is a widely known, well-recognized economist, is here. He always comes and speaks to LeaderPrime. We appreciate that. He is a very entertaining and educational speaker. You're going to really enjoy that. He holds a BS in mathematics from Baylor University and a PhD in economics from Rice University. He always felt that the BS would have been better, somehow more appropriate for economics. He took his first economics course on a coin flip between economics and psychology. If it had gone the other day, there might be some really messed up people in the world. This is pretty good. You wrote this yourself, I thought. Yeah, well, Dr. Perryman has received an honorary doctorate from the International Institute of Advanced Studies. After that one, he told his kids they had to start calling him Doctor. They preferred dork, dweeb, nerd, geek, and loser. And that was on a good day. Anyway, Ray has come and spoken with LeaderPrime class, I think, every year. And he always is entertaining. He has a great perspective on the economy, politics, and what's going on in the world. So, Dr. Ray Perryman, Ray.
Well, thanks, Ken. I appreciate it very much. It's a pleasure. Is this working okay? We're good? Okay, good deal. It's a pleasure to be here with you and spend a few minutes. I understand you're a little bit behind schedule. I'm not the one to get you back on schedule. I can promise you that. That's not what I do. I don't think I've ever got anybody back on schedule in my life. Hopefully I won't get so wound up that we can't have a few questions at the end. It is a privilege to be here. As Ken mentioned, and by the way, before I start, this man has given a lot of great service to this community. I'd like y'all just give him a round of applause. I'm serious. For decades. No, it's awesome. We've been friends a very, very long time, and it's always a pleasure. The reason that I work in Waco and live in Odessa is I've always worked in Waco, and 30 years ago I married the mayor of Odessa. Okay. And the first law of economics, I don't care what any textbook says, the first law of economics is if you marry the mayor, you move. Okay, that's it. So I ended up in Odessa. And but the weird thing was, I travel all the time. In a typical year, I'm like on the road 300 days, 275, 300 every year. So she always told people the secret to our marriage was we've been married for 30 years and together 3 weeks. And then along comes COVID, and all of a sudden I'm home for 300 days in a year. That was a big adjustment, I have to tell you. And one day I was on her absolute last nerve, just absolute last nerve. And I think it's one of those days that ends in a Y because those are my worst. But anyway, so I said, honey, the problem here is, I'm here all the time now. I said, I'm kind of like bad tasting medicine. I'm just better in smaller doses. And she said, no, you're nothing like bad tasting medicine because ultimately, bad tasting medicine makes you feel better. So, don't choke, okay? It's okay. Okay. Since you almost choked, I'll do one more, okay? Another story about my wife. As Ken mentioned, I've got an interesting resume. I've got to do a lot of interesting things in my life, and a lot of people have said nice things about me. Some not so nice. That comes with the territory. In fact, there was an editorial written about me in the Corpus Christi paper about a week or two ago that said I was an equal opportunity offender because I make both parties mad at once sometime or another. But anyway, a few years back, this one really meant something to me. I grew up in a little rural town about 100 miles from here in East Texas, and they started a Distinguished Alumni Award at the school a few years back, and they were kind enough to give it to me. And so I went back and saw some old friends and had a nice time. And my wife asked me what it was like growing up in a town that small. And man, it was great. I loved it. It was wonderful. And she said, well, were there any challenges? And I said, no, not really. I said, nobody knocked their door. Everybody knew everybody. It was great. Good place to grow up. And she said, well, there had to be problems in a town that small. And so being kind of smart like that I can be sometimes, I said, well, we did have this one problem. I said, it was so small. This always bothered me a little bit. We had to take driver's education and sex education in the same car. And she thought about it a minute, and she said, Ray, that makes perfect sense. You can't drive either. So just want you to know the respect I get at home, okay? Okay. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to try to cover a lot of different things because there's a lot going on in the economy right now, and hopefully I can make a little bit of sense out of it in some ways that may be a little bit different once you're on the news and that sort of thing. And having heard Christina, I'm probably going to add in a couple of things I wouldn't add in otherwise, which is just what you want me to do when you're already behind schedule. But she kind of inspired me to talk about a couple of issues I think are important as well. So anyway, let me start out with. I mean, none of us want to dwell on COVID. I mean, it's very nice that we can all be together in one place and sit here in a room together. That's a nice luxury that we all took for granted for most of our lives, and now I think we appreciate it a lot more. I didn't mind putting on pants at all this morning to come talk to y'all. I really didn't, After 2 years of giving speeches by Zoom where I have no idea if, I wouldn't have even known you nearly choked, if it hadn't been, I might have kept going and killed you, But, but anyway, but I don't want to dwell on it, but there's a couple of things about it just to kind of give you perspective I do want to mention and then kind of tell you where we are relative to that now and a little bit about where I think we're going. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about all the stuff in the news right now, supply chains and inflation and Ukraine and workforce and all that stuff, because it's all, we're just kind of bombarded with economic news right now, and more seems to come every day. And then toward the end, I'm going to preach a little bit. I'll get on my soapbox. It's kind of, like I say, kind of inspired on that. And when I do, when I get on my soapbox, I'm almost 5'7", so I'm pretty dangerous at that point. I just want to let you know. But anyway, the first thing that was different about this than what we normally see is, normally when we have a recession in this country, you probably had a text class at some point in your life where they told you about a business cycle. We hadn't really had those in a long time. We really haven't. And we never had a sine curve. It was never that good. But business cycles really happened back when they first started teaching us about economics, because most economies were agrarian. And if you're an agricultural economy, you're going to have cycles. As you get more complicated, though, one thing can go up, something else can go down, and you can kind of keep rolling along okay on the whole. And we certainly see that in Texas, because basically when the price of oil goes up, everybody else doesn't like it. And there's certain parts of our economy that like it a whole lot, and so same thing. When oil goes down, our oil guys don't like it. Everybody else likes it because everything else gets cheaper. So it ebbs and flows. Normally, when we have a recession, it's because we did something stupid. That's how we usually have a recession. We create a bubble of some sort by going crazy. The last one was mortgages. The one before that was .com stocks. The one before that was syndications. We threw one in the middle with forgetting that we had to balance our debits and credits, and so we had one for that. But it's always something we do that's kind of stupid, and there's kind of a programmed way we deal with those. The president has a summit. The president appoints a task force. We all get together and figure out kind of ways we might fix it a little bit, get all that through Congress. At that point, they're scared enough they'll pass something, and then we go on down the road. And that's kind of how it usually works. This one was like a bolt of lightning from the outside. We'd never seen anything quite like this before. And the thing about it was how fast and how hard it was. That was one thing that made it so different and so hard to deal with. And you all had to deal with it in your own businesses, personal lives, every other way. We all did. But just to give you a little bit of perspective on the numbers, during the Great Recession back in 2008, the one with all the mortgages, which was at that time the worst thing we'd had since the Great Depression, over a course of 14 months, we lost 9.4 million jobs in this country. 700,000 jobs a month. It was brutal. It really was. This one, 22 million jobs in 2 months. 2.5 times as many jobs, 1/7 the time. We had never seen things. In April alone of 2020, we dropped 20 million jobs in 1 month. The greatest recession we'd had in a century only did half that amount in 14 months. It was just just a bolt of lightning that hit us. And the second thing was, even though we started making progress after that, just how hard it was to come back. And I'm going to give you one more set of statistics on that. Then I'm going to move on to other stuff and talk about kind of where we are now relative to where we were then. But think about this for a minute. There's a number that only geeks like me ever paid attention to. Before the pandemic, they started covering it a little bit in the paper lately, and more people pay attention to it, a thing called initial claims for unemployment. Now, we have a rule in economics, never use one word when four will do, okay? Initial claims for unemployment is layoffs. Think about that. Why do you file an initial claim for unemployment? Because you lost your job. It's layoffs, okay? That's what it is. The highest that number ever, and the reason we started paying attention to it so much in the pandemic was it comes out once a week. So it was a real good snapshot. When you didn't know what was going on, this was a snapshot. You get kind of a quick look at where we were. The highest that number had ever been since we've been keeping records was back in the mess in the 80s. 1 week it got to 695,000. During the Great Recession, it got to 660,000. But we had never seen 700,000 since we've been keeping these records, which goes back several decades. We'd never seen 700,000. 1 week in April of 2020, it was 6.9 million, 10 times the biggest number we'd ever seen. But let this sink in. That's bad enough. It did not go below 700,000 for 54 straight weeks. We had never seen 700,000 before. So for 54 straight weeks, we had more layoffs than we had ever had before. I mean, that just gives you perspective of just how much this was to deal with and how different it was and how tough it was. Fortunately, some other people were getting hired along the way. So, but that was how bad it was. Of course, now we're at record low levels because of some of the workforce stuff I'll talk about in a minute. Well, where are we? Well, this morning you may have seen, if you got up early enough and before this thing started, we gained 400,000 jobs in the United States this last month, 428,000 according to the first release. That gets us back to where we're about 1 million down from where we were before the pandemic ever started. So we're almost back to where we were in February of 2020. We're 1 million jobs down. That's less than 1%. Workforce is about 150 million, so that's we're down under 1% now. That's we're making headway. Here in Texas, we lost 1.4 million jobs when this thing happened. It's a lot. As of November of last year, we broke even again. The state's now up 240,000. So we're outperforming the country by quite a bit there. The Metroplex, you got back in 15 months. Okay, you're up 180. You were down about 425,000. You're now up by 180,000. Now let that sink in for a minute. The state's up by 240,000. The Metroplex is up by 180,000. Okay, Austin, which is smaller, but they've been doing well too. They're up by 80,000. So if you add the Metroplex and Austin together, you get 260,000. The state is up 240,000. So everybody else, some are better, some are worse, but everybody else on balance is not quite breaking even yet. Okay, but the big generators of growth that have been that way for the last couple of decades are the ones leading us out of this as well. In all honesty, I got good news and bad news about that. Dallas kind of beat y'all so far. They've grown a little bit faster than you have. That's not really bad news, but it's just a fact. Okay, but the last 2 or 3 months, you've been kicking them. Okay, and I think you're about to kick them even more. Okay, and here's the reason why. It's a very simple reason. Both are big, diverse economies with a lot of things going on. But Fort Worth, because of the Barnett Shale and the aftermath of that, has a little more energy dependence than Dallas. Okay, and energy's been one of the slowest ones to come back. That's about to change. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, okay? The other thing is both communities are big centers of tourism and visitation and that sort of thing, but relatively you're a lot bigger than they are because you've got the big stadiums, the big theme parks, the art museums. We did a study on the cultural impacts of various cities in Texas a number of years ago, and hands down Fort Worth was number one. I mean, nobody else was even close, I mean, you are kind of a cultural tourism kind of center, and that industry has had a hard struggle getting back. And so you had kind of two that were a little bit more difficult to work with than the composition of Dallas. And that's why yours was just a little bit slower than Dallas. But still, again, right up there, again, you're knocking the top out and net gains in jobs and before the state started having them and that sort of thing. And again, I think that industry has started to really pick back up now, the tourism side. Energy's about to. I think we had more drilling permits issued in March of this year. We don't have the April data yet, but we had more drilling permits issued in Texas in March of this year than any month in the history of this state. Okay? That tells you something. And I'll get into more of the whys and wherefores of all that in a minute. So that's kind of where things are. As far as the forecast is concerned, we're projecting our 5-year forecast for output in this region, in this area, in Dallas-Fort Worth area, is about 3.8%. It's about 2.2% job growth. Those are really good numbers, a little bit front-loaded. We'll do a little bit more this year because we're still kind of getting some things back, and then get down to more normal levels. That's in line with where you've been growing for a long time. But and we don't see anything that's going to knock us off that train. I'm not one of those who thinks we're about to have a recession, and I'll talk about that in just a few minutes as well. It's very rare that you gain 400,000 jobs in a month if you're about to have a recession. That doesn't happen very often. In fact, in the history of the world, it's happened 0 times. Okay, so I feel pretty good about that one right now. But some folks are predicting it. Some folks are always predicting it, though. And you only have to be right occasionally in this business. But anyway, so what I thought I'd do now is kind of backtrack and usually I spend a lot of time on the local economy when I come talk to this group, but there's so much going on right now. I thought I'd kind of bring it back up to a higher level and talk about the supply chains, inflation, and all that kind of stuff, and try to give you a little bit different perspective on them, and what's happening, what's not happening, and that sort of thing, because a little of it is not covered quite as well as it should be in the media sometimes. They don't quite peel that onion back quite enough layers to really give you the kind of common sense of it all, and I'm going to try to do some of that. But I can start anywhere. They're all kind of related to each other. But let's start with supply chain. Do this for me. Use your imagination for a minute. Think of the biggest engine that you can possibly imagine. Okay? Double it. Triple it. Quadruple it. Think about $100 trillion engine. Okay? Because that's what the world economy basically is. Okay? And that engine's been humming along for 10 years, doing just fine. I mean, oil change every now and then, but it's doing okay. A little bump here and there, but I mean, it's just chugging on down the road. Seems to have plenty of sea legs left in it. Doesn't need a major tune-up or anything like that. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you stop it. And I don't mean you tap on the brakes. I mean, you turn off the key, jump out, and let it hit a tree. Okay. And then you get a bunch of folks, and you get a bunch of sledgehammers, and you go over there and just bang on that sucker for a while. I mean, just all over the place. Just knock it around as much as you can. And you just let it sit out in the elements for about 6 or 8 months. Okay. Then you kind of try to restart it, and you get it kind of futzing along just a little bit. And you say, oh, no, that doesn't feel good. Let's just hit another tree and do it all over again. Okay. And then you try to restart it. That's what we did. Okay. It would not be a smooth startup. And the global economy has not been a smooth startup because we can't get all the stuff it takes to make all the other stuff all in the right place, produced like it should be, and doing everything else like it should be all at one time. It takes a while to get that done. It takes a while to get stuff back into the ports and everything. And it's creating a real crisis. The one thing I'll say about it is, and there's not much I can say good about it is, but markets, I have a whole lecture I've made students endure from time to time. You won't have to do it, I promise. But about markets, about what's great about markets and what doesn't work so well about markets. But one of the best things about markets is the minute you create a problem, you automatically create the incentive to solve the problem. All of you know that in your business. I mean, you're trying to meet some need that's out there. I mean, if there's a need, there's profit in meeting that need. And so, we have a vested interest in getting the supply chain on track, and we're making progress. If you would have asked me a month ago, I'd said, give us 4 or 5 months and we'll have this thing back on track. If you ask me now, I'll say, give us 6 months and we'll have the thing back on track. And the reason I changed it was a couple of things. The Ukrainian situation has messed it up again. Okay. And and China suddenly decided not to produce anything for a while, has messed it up some more. So there's just a lot of headwinds on all that right now, but we are making progress on it. Things that normally we can roll with 1 or 2 kind of bad things happening in the economy if everything else is chugging along, but when you got something like the pandemic going on, 1 or 2 little bad things can really mess you up. Like there's 3 big plants around the world that produce chips, the chips that we use in most cars and all that stuff that have been hard to come by, refrigerators, washing machines, all that stuff. Just so happened we had a fire in one of them in South Korea right in the middle of this thing. Again, we could roll with that under normal circumstances. We could figure it out. But when you layer on the pandemic, it becomes harder. Y'all may have heard about it, but last year in February, we had a little cold snap here in Texas. And you might think, well, what does that have to do with anything? People don't realize this. 1 out of every $5 of international trade in this country is Texas. We are a huge part of the global economy. When you shut our ports, and that big airport not far from here, down for 9 or 10 days, and cargo can't get in and out, you've messed up that supply chain some more. I mean, it's measurable. It's big enough to affect what happens. So all of these things were happening at once, kind of messing us up with the supply chain. But by the same token, we're double shifting the ports. We're doing things. We're making progress. You've heard some numbers recently that the trade deficit hit an all-time high. And all these guys on TV start wringing their hands about it. You know what that means is? It means we unloaded boats. No, they're not imports until you get them into the place and do some paperwork. You know, we unloaded more boats, so the trade deficit went up. You just saw another one, man, they went crazy over this one last week. The GDP went down last quarter by 1.4%. Oh, man, recession's coming. It's terrible. It's awful. If you take imports, the fact that imports went up, because that takes away from GDP, because that's something coming in from somewhere else, not ours. You have to subtract that from GDP. If you had to endure that chapter on national income accounting sometime, you might remember that. If you pull that out, the economy grew by 2% last month. The entire reason we had a downturn in the economy was we unloaded more boats. Okay, so I mean, that's what it is. I mean, that's why I said, you know, some of this stuff you have to kind of peel that onion back a little bit. But if you break down the numbers, that's what it was. Okay, which means we're making progress on this. It's going to be with us a few more months. Can't get away from it immediately. Let me kind of shift gears and talk a little bit about. And of course, Ukraine has really made it bad because it messed up the oil markets, and I'll say a little more about that as we go along. Let's shift over to inflation for a minute. That's a complicated one right now. There's a lot going on with inflation. Okay, and a couple of things I'll tell you about. First of all, I'll kind of break my story into short term and long term. Okay, within the short term, there's an old definition that you've probably heard somewhere of inflation. Everybody uses it. Man on the street definition: too much money chasing too few goods is what causes inflation. And there's merit to that. It's a decent definition. There's nothing wrong with it. Okay. Either one of those can mess you up. Well, we know we have too few goods. We just talked about that. That's the supply chain. We also have too much money. And here's what happened. Y'all probably heard that the government spent a whole bunch of money in the last couple of years, more than we usually do. We usually blow about $1 trillion a year, but we managed to blow 7 or 8 in this time period. Now, I am not faulting us for that. We had to do some of that. I mean, you had people would have starved to death in the streets. Very well-run small businesses that have been around for decades could not have survived. We had to do it. It certainly wasn't perfect. We're seeing all kinds of reports about the fraud right now. We know they sent some checks to dead people. And in all fairness, there were some problems in the structure of the bills. That's inevitable when you have to cobble something like that together with an evenly split Congress. There's going to be some of that. But beyond that, just it's endemic to government. They can't do it in the most efficient way. For example, take the child care credit. They can't go knock on everybody's door and say, okay, how you doing? You need a little more money for your kids? Okay, no, you're doing okay. Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about you. Okay, you need a little money? Okay, here you go. You can't do that. You have to write a formula. And what that means is some people get some money they don't need. So they got extra money. A whole bunch of people got a lot of extra money out of this thing. In fact, one of the weirdest statistics of this whole pandemic is every time you have a recession, output goes down, of course, income goes down, of course, and jobs go down. I mean, that's kind of what a recession is. This time, output went down, jobs went down, income went up. And it went up because of all this money we put out there. Okay? So all of a sudden, you got all these people, and they've been cooped up for a year and a half. Can't do anything. Just frustrating as it can be. And all of a sudden, you kind of ring the bell and say, okay, y'all, you folks can go out and do something right now. And by the way, you got some extra money in your pocket. Well, what do you think they do? They rush out and start spending that stuff. That's your too much money, okay? And again, I'm not faulting us for that. Again, I fault us for any of you who've heard me speak before know I've been very critical of the federal government for years on the way they spend. A good friend of mine, I'm sure you knew, who was a very successful no, he's still alive. He's just not a politician anymore. Very successful politician used to tell me that the difference between Republicans and Democrats was they'll both spend more than you give them, but the Republicans will feel bad about it. In the last 10 years, they hadn't even felt bad about it. Democrats get in, they spend like it's going out of style. Republicans get in, they cut taxes and don't do anything to offset it. I mean, we just had this roller coaster of $1 trillion deficits. I have a lot of problems with that. We didn't have a choice with this one. What we were confronting was a bad choice. Let's jack up the deficit in a big way and jack up the debt. And a catastrophic choice. Let's let businesses go under and people starve. Fortunately, we picked the terrible choice. Okay, there wasn't a good one over here somewhere we missed. You know, that wasn't one of them. So basically, you know, we have to work our way through that. So that's a big part of the inflation. The oil situation in the Ukraine has made it worse because people are trying not to use Russian oil. There's uncertainty about future production of Russian oil. We could certainly replace Russian oil over time, but that's a big 2 words, over time. You can't do it immediately because you got to have more boats than we have. You got to have more drilling equipment than we have. You got to have more pipelines than we have. I mean, there's ways you could do that. There's ways we can do it with alternative energies, and as we deal with some climate issues as well, partially over time. But it's not the sort of thing you can do tomorrow. So that's really messed things up a little bit, made it even worse. And what people don't realize about that is everybody focuses on the price of gasoline. In fact, one of the biggest problems we have with short-term inflation is, in most people's minds, inflation's not the consumer price index. They don't wake up every morning and say, wonder what CPI did today. We don't do that, But you're going to drive by 20 gas stations today at least, and you're going to see that price there in big lights. And so we focus on the price of gasoline. Well, that's up 30, 40%. So our perception of inflation is really, really bad, okay? And it's bad enough without that, okay? But that's one issue. But the other thing people forget is, we got some publicity the last couple of days, petroleum's also diesel and jet fuel, okay? But forget about that even. It's plastics. It's synthetic fibers. It's paint. It's cosmetics. It's adhesives. All this stuff is petroleum. It's all made out of petroleum. So when the price of oil goes up that much, it's not just what you're paying at the pump. You're jacking up the price of a lot of things, not to mention everything you buy is transported in some way or another with something that uses some type of petroleum product. And so that's why it has that disproportionate impact on things. So anyway, that's kind of the short-term story on inflation. The headlines you're seeing, and they're technically accurate, worse since the late Carter years, early Reagan years, worse than 40 years, worse than 45 years, whatever. That's an accurate statement. This is not that time period. This is absolutely 100% not like that time period. And I'm going to give you just a quick example to kind of show you, but I can tell you I can really come at this firsthand. When I was a little bitty baby economist, okay, and I wrote my dissertation at Rice back in the mid-'70s. I know I look much younger, but what can I say, I got my PhD at 4, so I was, but no, I wish. But anyway, when I wrote my dissertation, it was part of it was a big, huge model of the monetary sector. And back in those days, big, huge models were kind of a new novel thing. This was almost 50 years ago, so there wasn't one on every block like there is now, And so when Ronald Reagan brought in Paul Volcker as the chairman of the Federal Reserve to try to bring inflation under control when it was 13, 14%, I had the only model out there. So I was still in my 20s, and they brought me up there to they didn't let me make any decisions, but they made sure I was doing the measuring, And so I got to kind of see that from the inside and kind of see what was going on. And what we had then that we don't have now was institutional inflation. And what I mean, and we haven't done that again. We tore it down. It was very painful to tear it down. We tore it down. We haven't built it back. None of you are probably old enough to remember this. Ken probably is. But if you went into a bank or a savings and loan in the 70s or early 80s, and you wanted to open a savings account, we're not talking to even buying a CD. We're just a plain old savings account. You got 5% interest. He remembers it. I remember it. If you go in today, you're going to be lucky to get one, okay, real lucky to get one. You probably have to buy a 3-year CD to get one, And so, and my point being, you kind of set a floor on the cost of funds when you do that. Federal contracts back then were set up with 30-day escalation clauses. They raised the price every 30 days in the contract. None of that stuff's there now. We don't have that institutional inflation. We have a situation where people have to spend out all this extra money. Now it won't take them that long, and we have to fix the supply chain. Then it'll start coming down some. Go look at the long-term inflation expectations numbers. They're up about 0.5%. I'm transitioning to long-term now. Wasn't that smooth? Yeah. And I think they will go up about 0.5%, 1% or so from where they were before, because they were about 1.5%. They're going to go to 2.5%, and the reason is we spent all that money. It wasn't a free thing. As I say, it was a bad choice versus a catastrophic choice. That's part of the bad choice. The Fed's having to raise interest rates now to kind of bring this thing in. They're having to get that balance sheet back under control because, man, they really bloated that sucker up during the pandemic. They had to. And so now they got to bring it back under control. All of that is going to bake in a little more long-term inflation in the future than we had in the past, but not really enough to hurt anything. And so that's kind of where we see, what's happening with inflation. How fast it comes down, a lot's going to depend on what happens in the Ukraine and with the energy markets and that sort of thing. Europe deciding to try to wean itself from Russian oil this quickly will probably keep a little more upward pressure on prices because, again, no problem to do it over time. To do it immediately, the structure is just not there to do that quite yet. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But anyway, let me move on. Let me move on to the workforce, because that's one we hear a lot about these days too. I'm trying to whip through these as fast as I can. The Great Resignation. Nobody's ever going to work again. Okay. Here's the truth about that. It is a huge problem. Unlike the others I just talked about, it's not a temporary thing. It's not something that's just going to be in 6 months, 8 months, we won't even hardly remember it. It's not that kind of thing. It is a demographic reality that we are going to have a workforce shortage for a long time. Everybody's talking about the 10 million, 11 million job openings in the United States right now. They're forgetting to tell you there were 8 million before the pandemic. They're not telling you that. 2020, when you got the numbers out, lowest birth rate in history of the country. I mean, literally in the history of the country. I mean, you go back to the plague in Jamestown, and the population grew faster that year than it grew last year. I mean, we're talking bad stuff here, okay? And everybody said, well, that's because of COVID. Well, let's do a little math. We kind of, you know where I'm going with this. We kind of figured out COVID in right the middle of March of 2020. So we're about 10, 11 weeks in. We figured out COVID's going to be a big problem. It takes 40 weeks to make one of those babies. So whatever birth rate we had in 2020 wasn't because of COVID. That one was baked before COVID got cranked up. Now 2021 may be different. Okay, what that one was a continuation of an ongoing trend that's been going on for a long time. It was a little bit lower than the previous record, which was the previous year. From 2021, when we get those numbers, may be interesting because a lot of people might have gotten scared and said, hey, okay, pandemic, we don't want to have a baby right now. We want to wait a while. By the same token, they were just together all the time with nothing else to do. So who knows what's going to happen. Yeah, but whatever it is, yeah. Yeah, but that's right. But whatever it is, it's an outlier. I mean, we've been on this long-term trend that's going to continue. I suspect it's probably going to look pretty much like the recent years have made. The census that Christina mentioned just came out. We have 1 million fewer young people in this country under the age of 18 than we had 10 years ago. Okay, so we don't have enough people. I mean, that's the bottom line of why we have a workforce shortage. The workforce participation rate, which is where that Great Resignation thing comes from, was 63.4% of the working age population was in the workforce the month before the pandemic started. It's 62.4 right now. 1% less. Okay? So we're not talking, I mean, this is not a radical, everybody's leaving the workforce. This is, we were already in a mess and this made it a little bit worse. Okay? And when we come out of the pandemic, we're going to be in the mess because we're in the mess before the pandemic ever started. Okay, there's a lot of ways we'll deal with it over time with some technology and some different things, and maybe hopefully at some point some sensible immigration reform. I mean, this is not rocket science. There are people all over the world that would love to come here and work. We desperately need people. You would think the two sides could get together and figure out a way to get them here, then let them work. That shouldn't be rocket science. But I think both sides like the issue more than they like solving the issue at this point, and that's a real problem for us, But, and when I think about the immigration problem, again, I don't want to dwell on it. I know it's controversial. There's basically three elements to it right now. There's the folks coming over from Central America, and that's the one getting all the attention right now at the border. And it is a problem. It's a huge problem, no question. But the solutions we're proposing are not working. We're not going to do it with walls and guns, I can promise you. Because think about this for a minute. Most of you probably either have kids or you were somebody's kid at one time or something, okay? I have 5 kids and 5 grandkids, so I can relate to this. If I was in a country where there was a drought going on and my kids were starving to death, and there were gangs in charge of that country who were going to wake up and kill them every day, okay? And I could walk somewhere and get away from that, I'd be walking. And if you send me back, I'm going to walk again. You can't, that's human nature. That's inside us. You can't stop that. You're not going to stop it with a wall. You're not going to stop it with a gun. You're not going to stop it with any of that kind of stuff. With making life tough on you, none of that. You're going to, we really have to deal with the issues over there to solve that. But that's not our workforce issue. We've never counted on those folks for our workforce. The workforce has 2 pieces. One is the undocumented population, which also gets a lot of attention here in Texas especially. We have a big one. Bottom line is we need to figure out an immigration reform to use those folks because we need them. 1 out of every 10 people working in Texas today is undocumented. This day, 1 out of every 10. 40% of our construction workforce, 40% of our agriculture workforce, 30% of our hospitality workforce. So if you want to go anywhere, grow anything, or build anything, We really need these folks to be here, okay? We need to figure out a way to do it that's rational and doesn't put them through what they go through, doesn't put employers at risk and all that. The other piece of it, which everybody forgets about, we have reduced legal immigration in the middle of this workforce shortage. 5 years ago, it was 1 million people a year. We got it down to 250,000. This makes no sense whatsoever. 25% of our doctors in this country are immigrants. If any of you work in the healthcare sector, you know what I'm talking about. 23% of our other healthcare workers are immigrants. If any of you are in the knowledge business, 23% of our scientists and engineers are immigrants. We need these folks. We've relied on these folks for a long time because we hadn't made people as fast as other places have made people, you know, and we're getting worse at it for some reason. So, I mean, I did my part with 5 kids and 5 grandkids. You can't look at me. But anyway, you know, point being that you know, this one's going to be with us for a while. This is not a quick fix. You work through the pandemic, get through something, and then everything's okay. We're going to have to deal with this for a long time to come. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in just a few minutes, but I got one or two I want to talk about again. Energy, very quickly, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but you're in, but you are in an area that has some energy, and you know the Barnett hadn't gotten a lot of attention lately, but that gas is still sitting there. It hasn't gone anywhere. And I want to talk about that for just a second here because it is very important. I think, did I mention at the beginning the column that they wrote about me a couple of weeks ago and called me an equal opportunity offender? Okay, here's where that came from. I was testifying down to Texas legislature, and somebody asked me a question that got me off on energy, and I started talking about how the federal government was screwing it up and how the Democrats were screwing it up. I didn't realize it, but at the same moment, my office was releasing a study I'd just finished on how the Republicans were screwing up with those truck inspections at the border, okay? And so all of a sudden, within the span of literally 10 minutes, I've got media covering me saying something bad about the Republicans, saying bad about the Democrats. So this guy happened to catch it, and he wrote a column about it. So anyway, that's how that happened. But we are making some mistakes on climate. Climate is a huge issue. We fundamentally, absolutely have to deal with it. There's no question about it, okay? But we can't get to where they say they want us to go in the time they want us to go, and we don't have to. If you look at, this is what kills me, if you look at the Department of Energy's numbers, we got a study coming out on this soon. If you look at the Department of Energy's numbers, the same folks who say you can't drill for oil anymore, don't want you to, look at their numbers. They did 5 scenarios in their last energy report. Every one of them shows more oil and more natural gas in 2050 than today. And that's with renewables growing anywhere from 300% to 700%, depending on which scenario you pick. I mean, it's not saying, I mean, we're going to replace a lot of stuff with renewables, and we need to. But even with that, we're going to have to produce more petroleum. And a lot of that's going to be natural gas because it's lower carbon content than oil. And and when you generate electricity with that to run your electric cars, you move it from pollution going up and down the road, like it does now in an internal combustion engine, to pollution at one spot at a power plant. So you can capture it a lot better and sequester it a lot better. They're already doing it at the refineries. They have the technology to do it at the utilities. It's just not quite cost effective yet. But the cost will come down over time. All that'll change. But anyway, so you know, basically it says we're going to have to produce this energy. And it turns out by a weird circumstance, obviously the natural gas is fine. That's what you have here. But if you go out to the Permian Basin where all the oil is, and this is just weird. I live out there now in Odessa, as he said. We can't claim any credit for it. Had to do with the tectonic plate shifting 250 million years ago. We had nothing to do with it. Nobody tweeted about it for a long time. I mean, it was kind of just happening. But the carbon content of the oil in the Permian Basin is the lowest of any onshore place in the world that has a major deposit of oil. We get most of our imported oil, people don't realize this, from Mexico and Canada. This oil from the Permian Basin has 71% less carbon than Mexico's and 74% less carbon than Canada's. 57% less carbon in the Middle East. So you at least start at a better place. You still have to produce it responsibly and then sequester as much of it as you can. You still have to do all that to make the climate thing work. You have to do it very differently. And that makes both sides mad at me. One side says it doesn't exist. We don't need to worry about it. Do what it drill, baby, drill. The other side says you can't drill at all. Well, the answer is kind of in the middle. You got to do it, but you got to do it more responsibly. And I think, again, we're about to see a lot of that happening with these prices where they are now. There's some realization of this. The other side of it, I'm going to give 2 things on the other side of it. One is world geopolitics we're dealing with right now. Everybody's talking about getting rid of Russia's oil. We can do that. We can produce plenty of oil. That's not a problem. It's going to take a little while. We can do that. That's not the source of Russia's power. The source of Russia's power is they control the natural gas that heats Eastern and Western Europe in the winter, and it gets really cold in some of those places. And that's what we have to fix. Expanding LNG capabilities and that sort of thing, getting to the point where if we did, and I told Congress this 10 years ago, if we could get to the point they didn't have to have Europe's natural gas, Russia's smaller than Texas economically. It becomes another mid-sized country whose ruler you couldn't name in a quiz show, that doesn't have the money to build a big military and doesn't have the ability to do all these things. The source of his power is controlling natural gas. We could fix that with natural gas that's just a few miles from here. Some of it's right here, literally right under the ground we're standing on, but a whole bunch of it's just a little bit west of here. And we could fix it with that and the natural gas in South Texas and East Texas and West Texas and a lot of other places. And most of the major LNG plants that are built now, we've done the permitting on all of them in the United States and Canada. Most of the ones that are built now and all the ones being permitted are on the Texas Gulf Coast. So we can fix that if they'll just let us. But anyway, the other piece of it though is humanitarian. And I really want to talk about that for a second. You and I were talking about it before we started. The alternative to not producing this energy is the world economy can't grow. The growth in the economy is happening in the emerging part of the world where they're shifting from agrarian economies to manufacturing economies, which is an energy-intensive shift, okay? If we don't produce the energy for them to grow, from all sources, all the above, renewables, everything, all of it, renewables, hydrocarbon, everything, if we don't produce energy for them to grow, there are 3 billion people in this world who live on $3 a day or less. There are 700 million people in this world, twice the population of our country, who live on $1.80 a day or less. That's a kind of poverty we can't even comprehend. The only way that gets solved is if we deal with the climate crisis and provide the energy that they need. And so that's kind of that's a current take on energy, like I say. And again, I wouldn't have spent that much time on it, but given where you are and that's what some of you may be in the industry, I don't know. I think it's important that we talk about that. Okay, that's a bunch of stuff. I am winding down, I promise, but I got a little bit more winding to do. I'm not quite there yet. Okay, we've talked about a lot of topics right now, but all of them in the news right now. But when you really get down to where's the economy going to be in 30 years or something like that, you can sweep away a lot of that. I mean, the stock market moves 1,000 points in one direction one day and 1,000 points in one direction the next day and all that kind of stuff. And, it's all that stuff. You can sweep all that away. When you get down to it, 3 things drive economies in the long term. One is trade and cost patterns. Where is it cheaper to make something? And how do we trade with it? And lately we buy a lot of stuff in Asia because it's cheaper over there. And we'll continue to buy a lot of stuff in Asia. But one thing the pandemic did was we already had the ESG movement kind of going on, environmental social governance, people focusing on a bit longer term thing than the next quarter. We already had that going on. This kind of put on steroids because they suddenly recognized it doesn't matter how cheap we buy those chips this quarter. If we can't get them delivered, it doesn't matter. Okay? So we're seeing what they call reshoring of some things. So that's actually going to help our growth just a little bit. And obviously this area is in a great position to capitalize on that. Good example, I mentioned chips a moment ago. Hadn't been a chip plant built in 15 years since the Samsung plant in Austin. Been a long time since they built a chip plant in this country. In the last 3 months, we've seen TI announce the $30 billion one just up the road in Sherman. Samsung's announced an $18 billion one just down the road in Taylor. And Intel messed up and put one in Ohio for $20 billion. So that's almost $70 billion of investment in that industry that would not have existed had we not been given a wake-up call about that. And we're going to see that in other industries, particularly like medical supplies, things like that, things that we need to have here, to keep ourselves together. We're going to see that kind of stuff happening. The second one's technology. Technology drives a whole lot of what we do, more than we realize. It still amazes me when I sit down and think, I didn't know what a smartphone was 15 years ago, and you didn't either. Isn't that amazing? When you think about how much they rule our lives today, we didn't know what they were back then. I see y'all looking at them right now. I know you're cheating out there. Okay, no, but anyway, that's how technology changes. Technology was changing very quickly before the pandemic. We've been on a roll for a while, but the pandemic created more needs for security, for communications, for being able to provide health care in a pinch, and education in a pinch, and workplaces in a pinch, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so basically, that's what that nice thing about markets. We need more technology. We will get more technology, because if you're the one that provides it, you'll make a bunch of money. And so that'll probably help us a little bit. The third one, and it's the most boring subject in the world, demographics. I've already talked about it a little bit, But demographics, I mean, it's the science of how many people are born, how many die, and where they move in between. I have a really good friend who's a great demographer, used to run the Census Bureau. And I used to tell him, I said, Steve, I know why you're a demographer. I said, you're great with numbers, but you don't have the personality to be an accountant. I mean, it is one boring subject, And so anyway, so with demographics, I want to talk about it just a minute. And some of the stuff that Christina was talking about kind of hit me with this. But I mentioned we have 1 million fewer young people in this country than we had 10 years ago. We have 440,000 more in Texas than we had 10 years ago. That is the greatest single resource this state has. It's more valuable than all the tech plants, all the oil fields, and everything else, is that we have this pool of young people that can be the workforce of the future if we train them. 440. 440. In other words, the country's down 1 million. We made up almost half of it. If it hadn't been for us, it'd been down 1.5 million. That's, we did our part. And it's because we have a younger population, and a lot of it has to do with our demographics. The fact that, the Hispanic population is younger than other populations, and that's what's growing very rapidly here. Now I want to interpose that, though. It's our greatest opportunity that we have. It's also by far our greatest challenge. I want to interpose that because you're leaders. You're folks who can make things happen. You're going to go out in this community and in your business, you're going to do things. Okay? You're people of influence. I want to layer demographics on top of that. Okay? 52% of the kids in our schools today are Hispanic. That's great. I mean, it's great, and it's growing very rapidly. The households those kids come from, if you add up the wealth of all the school-age households in this country or in the state, you say how much of it do the Hispanics have? It's 5.7%. So you got 52% of the kids and 5% of the money. The black population is basically stable. It's not growing a whole lot, not declining a whole lot. It's right around almost 13% of the school enrollment's been there for a long time. 1.6% of the money. So you add those together, you got 2/3 of the kids and about 7% of the money. That doesn't work. That does not work without a whole lot of help from us. Because what that means is if they need broadband at the house, if they need a tutor, if they need a software package, a summer enrichment program, some extracurricular training, any of those things, it's just really, really hard. If they manage to get out of high school and want to go to a trade school, well over half of them have to drop out for family financial reasons. That's documented. So we've got some real challenges to meet there. To take it a step further, obviously they're growing very rapidly, that's one thing, but 20% of those kids that come in have a language barrier when they come into school. I do a whole lot of stuff in the humanitarian sector, and this one grabs me a lot. If you walk in 2 classrooms randomly, 1 kid's homeless on average. I mean, that's the reality of the demographic we deal with. The Anglo population is actually declining in the schools because we don't have, we're not making babies like the rest of folks are. We have 125,000 fewer Anglo kids than we had 10 years ago, but we have 55,000 more that are economically disadvantaged. So, I mean, that's the school population that we're dealing with to turn into the future. Now, I'll give you 2 more statistics on, and then I'll shut up about it, okay? One of them's from the Census Bureau. It's a study they do every 2 or 3 years where they ask the question of all the people who are born and raised in a state, how many end up there as adults? Texas is always number 1 in that thing. The last one that came out was 78%. So roughly 4 out of every 5 kids that we educate in our public schools here in Texas are going to be in our workforce in the future, or not be in our workforce and be folks we have to try to take care of. But they're going to be living here, one way or the other. They're going to be here. Okay. The final statistic does not come from the Census Bureau like all those others. This comes from a really great source. This comes from the Perryman group, and those guys are good. I am telling you, they're good, man. Woo! And they're awesome. Now, not long ago, I did a little simulation for the legislature, and I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, let's assume the school system in Texas stays exactly like it is in terms of the percentages we graduate. We don't get better, we don't get worse, okay? And I'm talking elementary school, junior high, high school, college, graduate school, medical school, law school, whatever, everything, trade schools, everything. We just stay like we are. We don't get better, we don't get worse. And then before I ran the simulation, I put one more clause in there, by ethnic group. And then I just let demographics take over. Because that's not we don't control that half the equation. We control the other half the equation. In 15 years, taking out inflation, all that, in today's dollars, the average, not household, but person in this state has $6,000 less income than they have today. Now, what that means is we're no longer a state with a great workforce to attract all these big businesses. And we have a whole lot more social needs. So we're a whole lot more expensive state to try to live in and service. So we become exactly what we don't want to be. Exactly what in our worst moments we make fun of other states for being. You know, that's it. So basically, I say all that again because you are folks of influence. And in our communities, the single most important thing we can do to make sure this state grows in the future is to educate these kids. Okay. The second most important thing we'll do, and I wasn't going to probably get into this one, but it's only like a minute, I promise. But based on what Christina said, there's all kinds of political, religious issues and everything else associated with some of the things we're dealing with right now and some of the things she was talking about. And I don't want to try to change anybody's religion or politics or anything else. I just want to give you the economic lens on this. 86% of the knowledge workers in this country, which is the single most important asset for all these high-profile companies we want to keep trying to get in here, 86% of those workers say they do not want to work in a place that is not accepting and providing opportunities. They don't want to see voter restrictions. They don't want to see sexual identity restrictions. They don't want to see reproductive rights and all that. So again, politics aside, I'm not talking about politics. As a simple matter of economics, 10 years from now, those folks can say where a company locates. Because if you can't get those workers, you can't come. I mean, it's that simple. You know, you can't give them enough incentives or anything. They don't. They have to have that workforce. If we want to have that workforce in Texas, we have to take another look at those things. And our cities, and Fort Worth's done a good job with this, our cities have to adopt programs that say, hey, you know, we're going to be accepting here. But you still have to deal with the fact that, you know, they're going to have to deal with the state at some point. And so, you know, but that's another real issue. But that's a big issue we have to deal with, and education is a huge issue. On those very happy notes, if they'll give me any time, I'll take some questions. If not, thank y'all very much, regardless. Ken says I can take a couple of questions. Dave's pretty much shot anyway. Yes, sir. Let me bring you this microphone. I got my instructions from the back. They're watching me.
Thank you. Really fascinating conversation. Fort Worth, of course, wants to be a high-tech capital. I mean, it wants to be Austin with the jobs, but not Austin with anything else. That's sort of its thing. So how do you see it gets there? What is it? I mean, education, obviously, but yeah. What else? How else would you?
That's a very good question. How does Fort Worth get to be a high-tech hub? Basically, I mean, other than the obvious education thing, and it is, I think you have a lot to offer here. And I think to some extent it's a case of kind of harnessing that stuff and trying to mark together, because you, as I said, you have the best arts, sports, amenities, cultural activities in anywhere in this state by a long shot, and those folks like that. You know, be a very, very, very livable community. That's probably the single most important thing you can do long term. Is be a very livable community, the kind of community those folks want to go for. Otherwise, I mean, you have some things going for you. You're not landlocked, and I think that's a very good long-term advantage. Dallas is pretty hemmed in there right now, and you keep seeing this growth to the suburbs and all that. You're not landlocked. You know, Alliance is a nice magnet to pull some things in. We were on that thing back when it was a cow pasture. It was when the first time Ross took me out there to look at it. But so we got to be on the ground floor of that one, which was very exciting. But Alliance is something of a magnet. But again, I think you have a lot of assets, and I haven't studied this in depth. A good friend of mine, I think Tom Stellman, has worked with you guys with the community here in terms of some planning and that sort of thing. And Tom, his company's very, very good at that. But I think there's to a certain extent a little more differentiation from Dallas, because this is a unique place, and I think it's a place that could attract a lot of people. And I've often think about it, and I mean, I have a very special place in my heart for Fort Worth. Literally, I don't know if you know this or not, Ken, but when my favorite aunt when I was a kid growing up over in rural East Texas lived in Fort Worth, owned a beauty shop next door to Bob Boland's card shop. That's how, so I've known Fort Worth politicians for a very, very, very long time. But anyway, but the way I've often characterized, in fact, I put it in a book one time years ago, Dallas and Fort Worth could just as well be 200 miles apart. It is a fluke that they were 30 miles apart. Dallas was the railhead headquarters of the cotton industry. Fort Worth was the end of the cattle trails. And one of them's southern, one of them's western. And obviously, grown together over time, done a lot of things, but there's a very distinct and I think very attractive culture to Fort Worth that doesn't always get to shine through as much as I would like to see it. So I think there's a lot to be marketed about Fort Worth. I think there's a lot, again, I think the workforce investment, all those are very important, but having available land and keeping that workforce and then getting the word out that this is a different place, is very important, because there's absolutely, I mean, you have universities, you have the stuff you need to support this sort of thing. You have good universities, you have good, you have a lot of very positive things going on, great, phenomenal amenities. I mean, when you look at the theme parks, the sports facilities, and by Fort Worth, I'm talking about Fort Worth Metro now, pulling in Arlington and all that stuff, but you have just a whole lot of things going for you, and you have, again, that energy sector, which is itself going to become more and more and more technological over time. And that's the other thing. I think sometimes you have to broaden your definition of what high tech is to some extent too, because it's very different. But I think though, I mean, again, there's no reason why you can't. Dallas gets a lot of headlines, but part of the issue there is, and again, I'm not knocking Dallas. Dallas is a great community, but if something goes to Frisco or McKinney or Plano, the headlines in the national press are that it came to Dallas. I mean, and frankly, if you came to Fort Worth, that might be the headline that it came to Dallas. You got to work. I think that's something that establishing that true identity, but that this is a unique and different place. It's not a bedroom community, and you've never been that. But all those others kind of, although they've developed a lot more, like Frisco in particular, we did an economic development study for them when they started. They had 7,500 people. Now they have 200,000 or something. It's crazy. But develop a separate identity. That's really a unique identity of this area, stuff that I've always felt like was missing a little bit, because it's just such a great place. It really is. One more, I assume.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure. Okay, then you get one too, because he didn't get the last one.
You touched on this a while ago, but the economy of Russia is smaller than the economy of the state of Texas. Am I correct? How do they afford to fight this war?
They can afford to fight the war because of oil and gas. I mean, it's that simple. I mean, John McCain a number of years ago made a very profound statement about that, and it's it's simple but true in his way he could do things. He said Russia's a gas station. I mean, that's really what it is when you get right down to it. You take Texas. We think we're dependent on oil. 15% of our economy is based on energy. 85% of our economy is based on energy. I mean, they are an energy economy. That's why I say if we can, over time, take away the hold they have on Europe with natural gas, they're no longer a factor. They're one more country, one more middle-sized country out there among the many. Like I said, if this was a quiz show and I asked you to name the leaders of 5 of them, I don't think anybody in this room could do that. He'd be on that list, but for what we, that one thing, but again, you can't solve that overnight, unfortunately. And when Europe's talking about weaning themselves from their oil, which it's going to be painful, but it may be possible. They can't wean themselves from their gas yet, because we can't get ours over there fast enough, and there's not enough other immediate sources. But over time we can. Yeah, you had a question.
So when we think about Texas as a whole, when it comes to bringing businesses in and the growth, you look at companies like Tesla, for example, and then the EV industry within the next 5 years or so as it's trying to improve. I'm getting hit every day on the stock market with EVs, so I'm really interested in that. But the electric grid that we currently have now, what type of investment do you think we need to invest in that electric grid, and what impact would that have on the economy right now, taking into consideration what the long-term goal could be?
Very good. Full disclosure before I answer that one, I am currently working with 3 companies who are trying to do things on the electric grid. I was on the task force that designed the current system, and so I just want to say all that up front. It won't affect what I say at all. What we have to do, we can have an electric market. We can have a market for power. What we have to do, and I'll say 2 of us told them that 20 years ago, and they would not do it. The legislature wouldn't do it. I was one. The other one was Pat Wood. Some of you know Pat. Maybe he was Bush's chairman of the Public Utility Commission when he was governor, and then when he became president, he was head of FERC. And he's now working for the Hunt companies on putting batteries on the grid. That's what he's doing. But Pat is the single smartest guy on energy I've ever met in my life. I mean, he really is. Good old Port Arthur boy. But anyway, what we both told him was when we set up the grid, what we did not do, the big fallacy that we did not do, we did not create a capacity market. And I'm going to have to get in the weeds just a little bit here. But the only way you make money in Texas selling power, if you're in the competitive part of Texas, the only way you make money selling power is when you actually sell power. You don't make any money for having extra power on hand. Back in the old regulated utility days, they'd always build 120, 130% of what they needed. And, the rates would be set where they got a rate of return on that capital investment. I mean, it was the old rate of return rate regulation. So we built in extra capacity. Now, if you're not selling power, then you don't get money. So there's no incentive to build a heavy-duty base plant when most of the time renewables and combined cycle natural gas can meet all the power needs we have most of the time because it's just going to sit there all the time, not making money. We could have set at a level, okay, we need this much extra capacity, then set up a market, let folks bid on it, we'll provide this, and then you're under an obligation to always have that power available. If you're able to sell some on the side, that's fine, but you have committed to basically like the old-fashioned way, having some extra power around. If we did that, we could still have a competitive market and a viable grid.
So that's why Tesla is considering that approach.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why Tesla's considering that approach, and that's why and the thing is that the reason the legislature wouldn't do it, and it's typical political stuff. It would raise your rates just a little bit, because you'd have to be paying enough to keep that extra power around in case you needed it. So you'd have to pay a little bit more every month for that, and that's why they wouldn't do it. That's why they wouldn't do it. And they said, well, we need to worry about it because we've got all these coal plants sitting around and all these other old plants sitting around, legacy plants and all that. We don't need that stuff. Well, what happened in February when they tried to crank up those plants that hadn't run in 20 years? Didn't work out so well. Things wear out over time. And we didn't structure the market right on day one. And unfortunately, it really came up to bite us recently. And so, I mean, that's the fundamental thing we need to do to fix the grid, to fix the power situation. We should seriously consider. I don't think it's an absolute necessity, but we should seriously consider more linkages. We have a few, but consider more linkages to the other grids in the country. We are a self-contained grid for 85% of the state, and it serves us well for some purposes. But we should consider being able, in a thing like happened last February, being able to, pull in some power from other places. We should really consider that because I mean it's ridiculous for the state that produces 40% of the energy in this country not to have enough electric power. That's ridiculous. It really is. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, every time there's going to be a little bit cold or a little bit hot, they say, "Oh, let's be careful right now." We shouldn't have to do that. I mean, we should have it designed where there's extra capacity. And as I say, the old-fashioned way did it that way, and you didn't even know you were paying for extra power. They just approved a plan. It was 120% of what you needed, 130% of what you needed. You paid. The regulator set a rate. You paid it, and you didn't even know it. When they went to competitive market, they did not keep that piece of it, and that was a big fallacy at the time. And like I say, a couple of us tried to tell them, but boy, were we outvoted and outshouted. I mean, it wasn't even close. On that happy note, thank y'all very much.
Ray, thank you for coming. I told you it was going to be special, and I think it certainly has been. We really appreciate you coming and being here.